Okay, we are in a DHC 4 de Havilland Caribou. Now, Caribou's a twin-engine piston radial engine aircraft developed for troop transport. It was used by the US in the Vietnam War, but it's also, there's a few still operating in Canada for bush operations. It has a rear loading ramp, and it's the plane that inspired the eventual development of the de Havilland Buffalo, which is the turbine version and considerably more horsepower, and it can carry bigger loads. That was used a lot by the Royal Canadian Air Force. Now, this Caribou, we're going to do takeoff in a circuit and landing and stop and taxi back to the apron and then demonstrate the unusual reversing pitch propellers, which are normally found on turbine engines with beta pitch, but this is one of the few that I'm familiar with that has reversing pitch propellers. Now, the numbers for this aircraft, generally pretty slow aircraft. It'll take off, we'll rotate at about 63 knots, and now we're going to set the flaps at 25 degrees. It can be 15 to 25 depending on load and length of the field. So we're going to apply the brakes, rev the engines up to a manifold pressure of about 30 inches, release the brakes, and then full throttle, which will be up around 50 inches, and full fine. At 63 knots we'll rotate, lift the gear once we have a positive rate of climb, and we'll throttle back to about 41.5 inches, and then pull the propellers back to around 22 RPM. Anyway, if you've got all that, we'll get started. So, like I said, it's a lengthy checklist. We will assume we're using the checklist. Okay, we're throttling up to 30 inches, release the brakes, and start our roll and do a full throttle. So once again, we're only focusing on the main items on flying the aircraft. So once we hit 63 knots, rotate, positive rate of climb, and we'll lift the gear. Now we'll throttle back to about 41.5 inches, pull the RPM back into the low 20s, and reduce our flaps to 15 degrees for climb out. Okay, trim out the aircraft, and away we go. So we're heading at heading of 002, 20 degrees. And once we reach 500 feet, we'll do our left turn and climb up to circuit altitude, which is once again just below 2,000 feet. So we'll begin our turn, checking for traffic, and keeping the airspeed up at a climb at about 74 knots. So about 42 inches, 15 degrees flaps, 74 knots. Now, in the circuit, we won't be cruising for very long, but we'll normally we'd leave the flaps at 15 for a circuit, but we'll clean it up to demonstrate a full cruise, but it won't last long because we'll be getting ready for our descent. So we're still climbing up. Again, 74 knots, 15 degrees, and a power setting of about 42.5 inches. And we'll start our turn and level out for our turn into the downwind. So we're throttling back. Cruise will be about 28 inches with a propeller speed of about 1900 RPM. We'll clean up the flaps. Now during the downwind, we'll pull the power back to about 26. 15 degrees of flaps and gear down. So we'll do that about mid downwind. And trim out the aircraft for cruise. And we're getting up to a beam of the field. So I'm getting a cruise speed that's around 120 to 130 knots, depending on the power setting. But we're in the circuit, so we're keeping it a little slower. Okay. Now setting up for the base leg, we can leave the flaps at 15. We'll set up for a descent rate of 85 knots. So power and descent rate at about 85 knots, about 500 feet a minute. Even though it's a big aircraft, because of the speeds it flies, the circuit is about the same as smaller aircraft. We'll be touching down or flying over the threshold at about 66 knots and touch down at about 60. Once we turn final, we'll go full fine on the propellers, drop the flaps down to 30, and power to control a descent. Now it does go down to 40 degrees, but 30 gives you a good nose attitude. That's what I prefer, and it doesn't seem to make a big difference on performance, so I prefer 30. So we'll line up with the runway. I turned a little soon. Ideally you want to turn out so you're straight on final. So I'm watching my airspeed, trying to get it down, throttling back. Now immediately on landing, I'll full brake and do the reverse pitch. Now there'll be two red lights up in the dash that'll come on to indicate that we're in beta pitch. So just setting down, full braking, set the throttles, full reverse, red lights come on, and as you can see, landing roll very short. Okay, once we get settled, now again, normally there's checklists, there's radio calls. It is not ultra realistic what we're doing here. I'm just looking at the main points so that a sim pilot can get the numbers and have some success in flying a Caribou. So pretty soon we'll throttle up, release the brakes, and taxi back to the apron. With this plane, it will be fun to show you how we can back it into places. So away we go. And like any aircraft, you don't want to taxi too quickly, especially this one. It's a big aircraft. It's heavy. So you give enough throttle like any aircraft to get it rolling and then pull back close to idle. We're clearing the runway, come to a full stop, do our radio calls. It's an uncontrolled aerodrome, so we'll announce that we are clear the active, and then we'll progress. So we'll park straight ahead and back in out of the way. The advantage of reverse pitch, besides braking, is that you can go into unapproved or undeveloped airstrips, and if you have to, you can back all the way back down to the end of the runway to take off. You don't have to worry about turning around. All right, so full brake, and we'll pull the throttles back into reverse pitch. Two red lights are on, and feet off the brakes. There's the red lights, and we'll slowly start to roll backwards. You can just see us starting to go there now. Plane will pick up speed. Perhaps in another video I can demonstrate the loading doors, cargo doors on this aircraft. Okay, we're in position. We'll do an engine shutdown. Engine shutdown's pretty much similar to other aircraft. Pull a mixture, cutting the fuel to the engines. Once they're shut down, we can shut off the mags and the master radio switches and so on. And so that's what we're doing there now. Well, that's the flight simulator, does that, okay. And we'll continue doing proper shutdown, checking switch positions. Put the gust locks on, or control locks. And that's the de Havilland Caribou.